Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne. I'm from Wales and I have concerns about the Welsh Government's Relationships and Sexuality Education Code. In recent years, there's been a huge rise in the number of young people being referred to GIDS, the Gender Identity Development Service for Children. On a web page titled Advice on Implementing the CAS Review on the NHS England website, it states, in 2021 to 2022, there were over 5,000 referrals into the Gender Identity Development Service, run by the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust. This compares to just under 250 referrals in 2011 to 2012. There has been a dramatic change in the case mix of referrals, from predominantly birth-registered males to predominantly birth-registered females, presenting with gender incongruence in early teen years. Additionally, a significant number of children are also presenting with neurodiversity and other mental health needs and risky behaviours, which requires careful consideration and needs to be better understood. In a previous video, I explored how queer theory, promoted by American academic Judith Butler, has influenced the development of the new RSE code in Wales. The underlying premise of queer theory is that power lies within language, and by forcing a change in the language that is used, perceptions can be changed. Butler believes that there is a heterosexual matrix, a cultural acceptance that to be normal, a boy must be masculine and sexually attracted to girls, and girls must be feminine and sexually attracted to boys. Those who don't fit into this matrix are at risk of being ridiculed. To undermine this matrix, Butler proposes changing our discourse to minimise the significance of biological sex and elevate the significance of an internal gender. This is a social engineering experiment, with Welsh school children being the guinea pigs. The drive at social engineering is evident in the RSE code, where the only reference to the words male and female in the code and the Designing Your Curriculum page on the Hub website is to define these words as gender identities. It seems that the Welsh Government are encouraging teachers to teach our children that uniquely among biological organisms, in human beings, the words male and female refer to gender identities rather than sex categories. This redefinition of the words male and female is not an aberration. In June 2020, the Welsh Government published the School and Community-Based Counselling Operating Toolkit. The ministerial signatories were Kirsty Williams, the Minister for Education, and Minister for Health and Social Services, Vaughan Gething. Under the heading Non-Binary and Transgender Children and Young People, the toolkit states, not all children experience themselves to be exclusively male or female, boy or girl, either in an embodied sense, an internal sense, or in terms of their social gender, or a combination of these. One would think the Welsh Government would ask why some children do not experience themselves to be exclusively male or female in an embodied sense. The goal of queer theory is to undermine the heterosexual matrix. The objective is to minimise the significance of sex and elevate the significance of gender. The desired outcome is for our young people to see themselves as gendered souls rather than sexed bodies, and in this way undermine the social expectations that people have based on someone's sex. This is not hyperbole. In an industrial tribunal hearing in May 2022, Kieran Medcalf, Stonewall's head of trans inclusion, stated, "Bodies are not inherently male or female. They are just their bodies. The consequence of this is that queer theory has given vulnerable young people a language that enables them to erroneously rationalise feelings of disembodiment. A resource for the use of teachers in the teaching of RSE to secondary school pupils in Wales is available on Hub, the government education website. The resource is called Agenda, and it has been endorsed by Cardiff University, the NSPCC, the former Children's Commissioner for Wales, Welsh Women's Aid, and the Welsh Government. The resource has a section on social media that encourages pupils to use Tumblr, a microblogging site popular with teenage girls in the mid-2010s that spawned a huge range of gender and sexual identities. Two researchers, Shay Woolahan and Hannah Borelli, investigated the role of Tumblr in the popularisation of gender identities. This is an extract from their presentation at the LGBT Alliance conference in 2022.
The culture war that we are now seeing argued in public life was once argued by teenagers on the internet in the early 2010s. I am joined today by my friend Hannah, and we will explore how young people today seek identity online, how they create online subcultures, and how the ideas proposed in these subcultures shape wider societies. Many of us are guilty of brushing off social media discourse as the ranting and ravings of blue-haired teenagers that don't have much of an impact on the real world.
However, over the course of only a few years, what was being written online by lonely, isolated teenagers became commonly held beliefs in the education system, in corporate HR departments, and in the charitable sector.
An example of this, in 2018, a YouTuber by the name of Riley J. Dennis posted a video where he compared homosexuality to racism and ableism. At the time, he received backlash for these ideas, but only a few years later, and CEOs of major LGBT charities are saying the same ideas.
Mass consumption of online hardcore pornography, low economic prospects, and teenage angst created the conditions that cause young people to identify with internet subcultures. How queer theory grew through academia is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is how young people on the internet took these ideas and built them into what many of us would consider gender identity ideology today.
One of the first social media platforms that became a hub of ideas was Tumblr. Tumblr was founded in 2007, and it is a microblogging platform that was originally used by creatives to share creative content such as photography, writing, and visual arts.
Tumblr quickly became very popular among teenage girls. It appealed to them through its emphasis on fan culture and art and alternative style. When Instagram and Facebook and other social media platforms were promoting this very rigid kind of femininity and high beauty standards, Tumblr became a safe space for teenage girls to express themselves, very importantly, anonymously outside of this rigid mold. As many young men became increasingly interested in right-wing politics, young women and girls were exploring gender identity, intersectionality, disability, gender fluidity on platforms such as Tumblr. Angela Nagel, in her book Kill All Normies, which was a history of the internet from this era, wrote that 4chan and Tumblr were like perverse reverse mirror images of each other. They fed off of each other. And Tumblr users were not concerned with economic inequality or trade unionism or class, like what they would call the quote-unquote old left. A new left was emerging, one that was concerned with identity, the fluidity of these identities, and how these identities intersected with each other.
The most important theme on Tumblr during this era was disembodiment. You have to remember this as we start to go through all of these crazy gender and sexuality labels that came out of Tumblr during this era. Teenage girls are prone to disembodiment as they start to go through puberty, and they experience things like sexualization and catcalling for the first time, and the body becomes a site of a lot of anxiety for teenage girls. The political ideology that they developed on Tumblr was therefore defined by a separation from the sex body and an intense amount of anxiety around sex and sexuality.
So Tumblr identity politics emphasized emotional fragility, and any challenge to these micro-identities, no matter how honest or sincere, was met with outrage. This was also the time that trigger warnings and safe spaces became very popular in universities. You might remember phrases like check your privilege and do better. It all came out of this time. And now many people might be thinking that these ideas aren't new. They're from academia, particularly gender studies departments, and you'd be right. But these ideas were made real and concrete on Tumblr. Teenage girls are not particularly good at nuance or philosophy or anything else because they're kids. So the complex theories laid out in Butler became really crude and simplified. Performing a gender meant literally being that gender in every sense, regardless of biological sex, sexuality, perception, appearance, anything else.
Butler's theories may have remained popular in postmodernist departments of universities, but the reason why gender identity ideology is so popular today and embedded in the third sector is because teenagers took their ideas and ran with them.
Activists have certainly ran with the ideas. As a presentation to head teachers in Wales explains, it is now mandatory that these TQ+ identities, popularised by teenage girls on Tumblr, be taught to children in Wales as part of an inclusive education.
Another really important consideration in terms of the approach for RSE within schools is about inclusivity and pluralism. So it's a really key within the code and the guidance about the approach that schools should take when they're delivering RSE content. So it has to be in a way that's inclusive, including LGBTQ+ inclusivity, and schools should really reflect on how inclusive its RSE curriculum is, and indeed that opens wider questions about how inclusive your curriculum as a whole is, and may lead you to consider if the resources that you use provide a different range of diverse, inclusive examples of individuals, of identity.
The school and community-based counselling operating toolkit continues. A growing number of children and young people identify within a range of gender spectrums, with research indicating the effects of early transition having a positive impact on well-being. This is quite a claim and contrasts starkly with advice given in a consultation document produced by NHS England in October 2022. The current GIDS service specification acknowledges that social transition in pre-pubertal children is a controversial issue, that divergent views are held by health professionals, and that the current evidence base is insufficient to predict the long-term outcomes of complete gender role transition during early childhood. The interim CAS report has advised that although there are differing views on the benefits versus the harms of early social transition, it is important to acknowledge that it should not be viewed as a neutral act. Dr. Cass has recommended that social transition be viewed as an active intervention because it may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning. In line with this advice, the interim service specification sets out more clearly that the clinical approach in regard to pre-pubertal children will reflect evidence that in most cases gender incongruence does not persist into adolescence, and that for adolescents the provision of approaches for social transition should only be considered where the approach is necessary for the alleviation of or prevention of clinically significant distress or significant impairment in social functioning, and the young person is able to fully comprehend the implications of affirming a social transition. Although it is now mandatory that these TQ plus identities be taught in schools as part of an inclusive curriculum, it is not mandatory that the experiences of those who regret transitioning be taught. Helena Lacroix describes her experiences of Tumblr.
I started, getting involved in online groups that were very pro social justice, very woke, and very into gender ideology, the gender is a spectrum, very new agey gender stuff.
Mm-hmm. Were these Facebook groups or on other kinds of platforms?
Tumblr mainly.
Tumblr.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know a lot about Tumblr, it's not as popular now, but back in the day, 2012, 2013, all the way up to 2016 or 17, it was pretty popular. No matter what interest you're in really on Tumblr, anywhere you are in the Tumblr space, it's very, very pro social justice and super duper woke. So yeah, I started getting involved in those communities and just gradually, it was a complicated process, and we can get more into how this happened for a teenage girl. But yeah, I just ended up after the course of a few years identifying as trans. And as soon as I turned 18, I went on testosterone, and I was on testosterone for about 17 months. So when I first decided that I would come out as trans, it was a gradual process. So I didn't just come out one day and say I'm a boy. I started with I'm a demigirl. My pronouns are they, them, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just progressively got more and more towards wanting to be a boy. But yeah, every step along the way, every time I would change my pronouns or change my name or something like that, all on Tumblr, people would be very supportive and send me messages being oh, I support you so much. This is amazing that you're doing this and being yourself and finding yourself. So there was a lot of support there. And I also, a big thing on Tumblr is most people who've been on Twitter will also recognize this, but it's when you're talking about an issue, if you're a straight white person, they would tell you that you're not allowed to have an opinion on that issue.
Yes.
And so that as a teenager, I always felt very self-conscious about that I wouldn't be able to speak my mind on anything. I like to speak my mind. I'm a pretty opinionated person. But yeah, I would always get that response that I can't say what I want to say because I'm a straight white girl.
Mm-hmm.
But after I came out as trans, that kind of went away. And I now had some credibility and ability to speak on different issues.
Yes.
So that was, aside from the support, it really felt like I could speak my mind better.
In 2018, Brown University School of Public Health Assistant Professor Lisa Littman coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria in a published article which described parents' accounts of their teenage children suddenly manifesting symptoms of gender dysphoria and self-identifying as transgender simultaneously with other children in their peer group. The article stated, "In online forums, parents have reported that their children seem to experience a sudden or rapid onset of gender dysphoria, appearing for the first time during puberty or even after its completion. Parents describe that the onset of gender dysphoria seemed to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends have become gender dysphoric and transgender identified during the same time frame. Parents also report that their children exhibited an increase in social media, internet use prior to disclosure of a transgender identity. Recently, clinicians have reported that post-puberty presentations of gender dysphoria in natal females that appear to be rapid in onset is a phenomenon that they are seeing more and more in their clinics. Academics have raised questions about the role of social media in the development of gender dysphoria." In an online webinar, Dr. Littman described her hypothesis that rapid onset gender dysphoria was related to psychosocial factors and compared two conceptual models for working with young people with gender dysphoria.
So, why is this so controversial? And I have to say, I have been thinking long and hard about this topic starting from, let's say, the day after my study was published. So this is why I think it's controversial. So currently there is a public debate, there is clinical debate, and I believe people are basically arguing from the positions of two conceptual models for gender dysphoria. And so I'm going to talk right now about a developmental model for gender dysphoria and an innate gender identity model, which you might call gender theory, you might call a gender affirmative model. So from a developmental model, gender dysphoria is may develop in the context of different kinds of cognitive, psychological, social, relationship processes. And the context is important because what you would do to help that patient is different. So for example, someone may become gender dysphoric because they are a young boy who is being bullied for liking ballet dancing, or a teenager who is discovering that she is same-sex attracted and having difficulty accepting herself as lesbian. Gender dysphoria might emerge after the trauma of a rape. And gender dysphoria might emerge in the absence of all of those things. And so the context is important because you would not treat somebody who develops gender dysphoria right after being raped the same way as you would somebody who's had gender dysphoria without any issues. So this is really viewed, gender dysphoria, as something that can have multiple causes, multiple treatments. Now, we don't have clear-cut causes, but just, I'm speaking conceptually. So context is important. Psychological issues, if they coexist with gender dysphoria, could possibly be underlying conditions for gender dysphoria. And I'm talking about the developmental model of gender dysphoria. From the developmental perspective, the desistance research is acknowledged within the strengths and limitations of the research. And as you would imagine, approaches really employ a thorough evaluation. So approaches that are consistent with the developmental model are a developmentally informed biopsychosocial approach, a systems approach, an exploratory approach. And these employ thorough evaluation and a judicious use of medical and surgical transition. So in contrast, there is the innate gender identity model. And this is more of a one cause, one treatment belief. So in this model, it's believed that there is an entity called a gender identity that represents a person's true self. And this gender identity may either match or not match one's biological body. And this is the source of gender dysphoria. And the treatment for this is transition. And because this is more simplified, the context is really not important. Psychological issues are thought not to be underlying conditions. And I'm just going to point out that's really more in practice than what's written. So the way it's written is that psychological issues are unlikely to be underlying or so, if you're thinking about psychological issues, the direction of, you can think that gender dysphoria might cause psychological issues, such as from discrimination and poor treatment, or that psychological issues may be completely unrelated, or you can conceptualize psychological issues as underlying. And so in practice, the suggestion of underlying conditions is often met with hostility and calls that's transphobic. So this is the more extreme version. The desistance research in the innate gender identity model is rejected. And these approaches are approaches that have minimal or even absent evaluation and liberal use of transition. So the informed consent model requires no mental health evaluation before accessing transition. And this is for individuals 18 and and older, and it's popular in the United States right now. And I do need to point out that the gender identity affirmative approach, there are people having a debate within this about what is the role of the evaluation, because recently 3 very prominent members of WPATH have spoken out and saying that they are concerned about the lack of evaluation because there is a trend of clinicians bypassing or considering that the affirmative model means that individuals don't need an evaluation. So, in other words, to say it more succinctly, the priorities for a developmental model are making the correct diagnosis and providing the correct treatment. And from the innate gender identity model, the priority really is quick access to transition. And people in both of these models believe that what they're doing is helping people, but you can understand why there would be a clash of priorities, because the folks from the innate gender identity model will view developmental model as being an unnecessary delay to transition. Transition is believed to be the answer, and delay is seen as harmful. Coming from the developmental model, there is concern that this quick access to transition is failing to diagnose important conditions and providing the wrong treatment to some individuals. So the reason that I believe the developmental model is superior is because there are a lot of outcomes for gender dysphoria and transition. And we know people who have who could be categorized in each of these. And we have research that describes these different outcomes. And so the developmental model accommodates all of these outcomes. Oh, whoops, I'm going to go back. So I just wanted to say, as everybody probably knows, so gender dysphoria may persist, it may desist. Someone may be satisfied with transition. They may only detransition because they are discriminated against, and they might detransition and not regret their transition. But there are people who are dissatisfied with their transitions, who detransition and regret that transition. So moving on, the innate gender identity model, in contrast, only accommodates some of these outcomes. So, so you can see where this information and these individuals and research about these topics challenge this model. And so what I've seen is that there are some behaviors that I think raise some concerns that people might be becoming a little ideological around this topic in this quick transition approach, because typically, you would use data to inform your model and not take the model and take your approach to decide to reject data and people. So, we've seen individuals and groups that deny desisters or really try and discredit detransitioners who regret transition. And we've seen some double standards applied to research. And so personally, I don't think that this approach is compassionate to the people who have these experiences that are not consistent with the affirmative model. And I don't think it's scientific to do so. So in a nutshell, why do I think that my work is so controversial? After thinking long and hard, I think it's because my research challenges the model and the approach to quick transition.
The Welsh Government are firmly wedded to the innate gender identity model. In the interim CAS report, it stated, "Primary and secondary care staff have told us that they feel under pressure to adopt an unquestioning affirmative approach, and that this is at odds with the standard process of clinical assessment and diagnosis that they have been trained to undertake in all other clinical encounters." In contrast, on a NHS Wales website that is used to train all medical professionals in Wales, it states, Referrals to gender identity services in the UK are increasing, including on behalf of young people under the age of 18. For the most part, this is likely to reflect improved access to information and representation. In 2020, the Department of Education produced guidance for schools in England that stated, "We are aware that topics involving gender and biological sex can be complex and sensitive matters to navigate. You should not reinforce harmful stereotypes, for instance, by suggesting that children might be a different gender based on their personality and interests, or the clothes they prefer to wear. Resources used in teaching about this topic must always be age-appropriate and evidence-based. Materials which suggest that nonconformity to gender stereotypes should be seen as synonymous with having a different gender identity should not be used, and you should not work with external agencies or organisations that produce such material. While teachers should not suggest to a child that their non-compliance with gender stereotypes means that either their personality or their body is wrong and in need of changing, teachers should always seek to treat individual students with sympathy and support. Similar guidance has not been issued for schools in Wales. Indeed, it seems that as the Welsh Government do not believe that social factors play a part in the decision a young person makes to transition, then such guidance is not required. Public Child Protection Wales are challenging the new RSE code, and a link to their website